So, well, first, thank you for having me here. Good morning. And yeah, thank you everybody for being here. I see Leandro, Eder is here, Anna, Alexander, Gustavo, you're here, of course, and Victor. So let me start with a question. How many of you are working with an open source project on a day-to-day basis? It can be an open source language, it can be, I know, an open source testing library, like Java, for example, or JavaScript or Spring Boot, right? There are many, many open source projects. And I would say that today it's almost impossible to be an engineer without actually using an open source project. And that's something that a few years ago it was impossible to imagine, right? Now, that doesn't mean that we are all contributing to open source, right? In fact, if I ask you now, like how many of you are actually contributing to open source, probably it would be just a handful, right? In fact, if you take, for example, Java as a language, there are 3 million devices running Java at the moment. There are 20 million Java developers in the world, but there are only 240 OpenJDK contributors. Now, that means that 240 people are actually deciding everything that happens in the language that 20 million engineers are using, right? And you might think this is a problem, but I actually see it as an opportunity because there is lots of room, right? And every one of you can be part of these amazing projects that we admire and we see it as super interesting, and we work with them every single day. And actually working on one of these projects can completely change your lives and your careers. Like it changed mine when I became a core contributor to Bootstrap. Now, the truth is that I wouldn't have been gotten to this place if it wasn't for a few mentors of mine. I would like to introduce you first to one of my mentors, which is Bruno Oliveira. Now, Bruno used to work at a bank in Sao Paulo, and he used to have lots of like regulations and things with bank security that make his work really not enjoyable. So he started contributing to a project called Torbox, and through his contributions, he got the attention of Red Hat, and eventually he got hired to work on a project called AeroGear. That's when he actually worked with me, and he was one of my mentors. Now, today, he's a super contributor to a project called Keycloak, which is super interesting. And him as a security engineer, that's like everything that he dreamt of, right? Now, at the time that he was working on AeroGear, he was one of my mentors. I was hired to work as a designer at Red Hat, and I joined the project, and I didn't know what to do. So I downloaded the source code from GitHub on my computer. I changed something on the HTML, and then I zipped the file and sent it to the email list of the community, which is completely wrong, right? So of course, the community at first laughed at me, but eventually they taught me, right? They taught me how to do Gits. They taught me how to interact with people, how to actually like be a member of an open source community. And eventually that led me to contributing to Bootstrap, which made me a core contributor to a project and making things that at the time I thought they were impossible, but they weren't, right? And if they were impossible for me, they probably aren't impossible for other people. Now, today, I got to a place where I'm an engineering manager of the team at Hero that builds the Stacks web wallet, as well as I am a core contributor to Bootstrap. I'm a contributor to the Eclipse Foundation. I wrote some articles for CSS Tricks and List Apart. And yeah, I couldn't be happier with my career and the place I am today, right? So today I would like to teach you all of these tricks, right? Everything I learned from my career and everything that you can do to follow like some of my steps in order to get here. So I'm going to go through things like how can you participate in open source? Why do we need? Who can do it? And in fact, I'm going to go through some secrets that people actually don't know that will be eye-opening to many people. So let's start by defining what open source is. Now, open source is first and foremost a community. It's basically a group of people that are getting together to solve something that they are passionate about, right? And open source needs every single one of you. And I'm going to show you how everyone has a place in a community. Now, historically, open source has always been a place for developers, mainly because usually software is the most obvious thing to contribute, right? But by no means an application is only made out of software, right? So Una Kravitz, who is a great designer at Google, she actually mentions that diversity can be what it can take open source from what it is to where it should be. And she's not only talking about the diversity of skills like designers and developers. She's also talking about diversity of genders, localizations, cultures, and societies, right? Any one of those together, they're going to make a better product than any one of those on their own. In fact, there are studies that show that the most diverse communities are actually the most successful. So designers, for example, play a huge part on open source because most of the contributors to an open source project, they are actually users that became contributors. But a designer will have a unique point of view, and they will keep users top of mind as engineers make decisions, especially defending those users that are not actively contributing to an open source project. Now, let's be honest. Writing is really, really hard. And if you don't believe me, go to any open source project, right? Generally, designers and developers, we just suck at it. And documentation is never up to date. But communication is key for an open source project, where members are collaborating remotely in an async way, and usually using a language that is not their native language. Now, documentation, especially in open source, they are never up to date. And I'm going to show you how documentation is probably the easiest step into getting into open source. Now, without communication, there is no community. And what do you write and what you say can be the difference between someone feeling welcome to your project or someone feeling rejected. So it's super, super important. Now, there is a ton of work for developers that don't want to code. So if you want to go and help people in forums, triage issues, review PRs, there is actually a ton of work. And I would argue that those people are actually not working, the people are making these projects successful. So hopefully by now, I convinced all of you that you actually have a place in open source. But why am I recommending you to work in a place that is going to leave you vulnerable, working with completely strangers without getting anything in return or no money in return? Well, mainly because open source is an act of love, right? It's voluntary work. It's something that you are donating to the industry. And giving back to the community can make a huge impact. For example, in Uruguay, every primary school student gets a laptop for free from the government. And all the software that is running those computers are completely created and maintained by the community. But apart from doing a huge impact in the society, actually there are some things that open source gives you back. Now, one of the most valuable things that you can get as an engineer or as a professional is your connections. And we are not lucky enough, or we are not all lucky enough to live in one of these centers of the technology where like you have hackathons and meetings every day. And even though Buenos Aires, which is a place that I live, it's an incredible place for developers, the truth is that Buenos Aires is not San Francisco. And not everybody has the time to go to conferences or hackathons. Now, open source opens a community of people that are talented and passionate around the world. And you don't have to go to like very important universities or go through endless meetings to get involved into these communities. In fact, almost without exception, every superstar of our industry, every people that we admire and we see in conferences and we read in Twitter, every one of them is working on an open source project. And if you want to work alongside them, if you want to share your code with them, get to correct each other and talk to each other, you can actually do it, right? The doors are completely open. Now, the other thing that you can do is show what you know. And even though open source should not be the path to getting a job, because if that's your goal, you might get disappointed. I know endless cases where people got jobs because they were contributing to an open source project. Now, you can do that actually getting a job without doing any interview, right? Or even without having the skills that you are required. And that's the case of this person on the right, who was another one of my mentors. His name is Daniel Passos. He's from Rio de Janeiro. And 8 years ago, he was contributing to a project called AeroGear. At one point, the manager of the project offered him a job. This was a really well-paying job for something that he really liked to do it. And he basically rejected the offer. So the manager was really scratching his head, right? He was like, why is he actually doing that? So he asked, and Daniel answered him that he was rejecting the offer because he didn't know how to speak English. He was actually contributing to open source project by working with Google Translator. So the manager, he wasn't ready to lose a good candidate. So he offered him the job anyway and sent him an English teacher to his house every single week for 2 years. And now Daniel moved to Canada. He's working on Shopify, and he's one of the leaders of the Android Shopify application. But he wouldn't have done that if it wasn't for open source, right? He didn't have a required skill to get the job, which was speaking English, and he would get completely out of any interview process if it wasn't for open source. Now, more on a personal level, open source lets you play with bleeding edge technologies at a scale that it would have been impossible to do it on a personal project or on a hackathon. And finally, it's addictive. I mean, it's really hard for me to explain the feeling that you get when you see your name attached to something larger than yourself. And that positive feedback is something that you really want to have over and over again. In fact, this is my first contribution to Bootstrap. It's only 7 letters. It's missing like a default flag to a property. And seeing my name attached to a project for the first time made me want to give more, right? In fact, if anyone is actually doing or using or have used Bootstrap later than version 4, you're actually using my 7 letters I wrote like a few years ago. So by now, hopefully, I have convinced you that all of you have a place in open source, and also that participating in open source can give you some things back. So let's talk about how you can find your people, how you can find your community. So my biggest advice is to just start looking to the places that you like and the problems that you like to solve. If you're passionate about something, probably there are more people that are passionate about the same thing. For example, if you're crazy like me and you like CSS, then contributing to a project like Puma, Bootstrap, Tachyons, or Tailwind, that would be a good idea, right? Now, I chose Bootstrap because while I was working at Red Hat, Bootstrap was one of the dependencies of the project I was working at. So when I saw a problem, instead of fixing it on my project, I fixed it upstream, right? I was giving back something to the community. So if you like to write, for example, JavaScript, and you are working on a project that has a dependency with React, probably contributing to React is a really good idea. But it doesn't matter where you contribute to. It's important to follow 3 rules. The first one is be capable to communicate correctly with people from different parts of the world, right? Remember that you are usually contributing with people that have different styles of communications, and probably English is never their first languages. So being humble, being positive, and always having good arguments, it's super important. The second one is to have trust, right? Usually you gain trust by starting with small contributions. And I'm going to talk about that later on, how making small contributions is really important to get your first steps. And that's how you can trust, and eventually you can make larger contributions. Another important thing about trust is imposter syndrome. We all have it. We all think that we suck at what we're doing, and you just need to trust that you don't, right? And it's really, really valuable what you can contribute. And the third one is to have respect. One of my best friends in open source tells me that working in open source is like working within a fishbowl, where you're the fish and people see everything that you're doing from outside, right? Every action that you take is visible, is transparent, and it gets registered. So that's going to leave you vulnerable. But a good and healthy community is going to always defend you. So always read the code of conduct, and if anyone is not respecting it and the community doesn't do anything about it, maybe it's a good indication that you should look somewhere else. An example of that is, I forgot his name. Ottavio Santana. So Ottavio is someone who used to live in the north of Brazil, in Bahia. Now he lives in São Paulo. He's a great open source contributor, and he used to work on a agency of the government, right, where everything he did was really full of bureaucracy. Sometimes he finished features and they were never implemented, and he thought that his career was not going to grow. So he thought himself that he could start contributing to the Linux kernel. So he went to the mailing list and he started asking questions. And people basically told him that in a very disrespectful way that he was useless. So he basically thought that C++ was not for him. So he started asking in the Java mailing list, and he eventually became a JCP contributor. Now, if you're actually using Java 7 or later, you're actually using his code, and he's a great member of the community at the moment. So now that you know how to find your community and how to behave, let's talk about the tools that you need. And the tools are really, really, really basic, right? You only need basically two things: to know how to use the command line and to know how to use Git. That's it. So the command line is basically a fundamental thing to just be a developer. But in order to contribute to open source, you need a very basic knowledge of the command line. In fact, I contribute to open source, and I know a very, very basic knowledge of the command line. If you don't know anything about that, you can read Working the Command Line, which is a really good book as an introductory idea. Now, the other thing that you will need to know is Git, right? There are many Git desktop and visual tools that you can use, but I highly recommend to get to know Git on the command line. Even though it's a steeper learning curve, it's actually a really, really good investment. You will need a GitHub account because most of the open source projects are in GitHub. And if you don't know Git, here are really good resources in try.github.io. And finally, you will need to know how to communicate. Now, different communities have different communication channels. For example, at Bootstrap, we use Slack to chat with users, GitHub to discuss code, and Stack Overflow for users support. Now, the hard part is gone, right? We know that we all have a place, we know how to do it, we know how to choose a community. So we are ready to take our first steps. And if you can take one thing from this whole talk, take this one. Start with very, very small contributions. The tinier they are, the better. Now, documentation, it's a great way to start. So just think about the things that nobody wants to do. Those are the things that any project will love you to do because nobody wants to do them, right? So things like documentation, tests, or translations, they are really good places to start. Something that I recommend doing is just go through the getting started or the contribution guidelines of a community and try to run them. You're probably going to fail. And then just add instructions to know how to succeed, right? And those contributions are going to be amazing. They're going to be merged immediately. And one commit that is merged, it's one commit. It doesn't matter if it's just one period that is missing or one typo or a huge feature. It's just one commit that is going to count to your ranking within the community. So again, start with very, very small contributions. Now, another thing that you can do is just start with administrative work, right? Go to review PRs, review issues, have a strong opinion about what you're doing, and just make it bold, right? Because once you start doing that, you are part of a community and you want the best for the community. So now that you know how to do that, it's time to step up, right? And I would like to share a secret. Even though there are many open source communities and there are many huge projects, there is no one contributing to open source. In fact, I already told you that the Java is written by 240 people, but even if you take something like React, it has thousands of contributions, but to get to the top 100 list of contributors, you only need 5 commits. And those can be 5 periods or anything. I mean, it can be really, really simple. So I'm going to show you exactly what I mean. First, I'm going to stop sharing my screen. Or actually, I need to share my screen. Let's see. So let's say, for example, any project, right? Let me Google, for example, React. So React GitHub. So if I go to React's GitHub account, and then I go to Insights, I can see the contributor list. So if you see, React is probably the most popular project in the world as far as front-end frameworks goes, right? It has like 178 stars, millions, 1,000 stars. And the top contributors have many, many commits, like thousands of commits. But if I scroll down to the bottom of the list, I can see that with only 6 commits, this person is on the top 100 top contributors list, right? This person only made like 51 lines of change. This one made like 13 lines of change. Probably if I check his contributions, there are tiny typos everywhere. Fix a small typo, right? And then this counts as one commit. But if I take like something like, let's say, for example, Wava. So Wava is a library from Google, about a Java library from Google. It's very popular. And if I go to Insights and the contributors list, you can see how if I scroll down, with only one commit, you will become one of the top 100 contributors to this project. And this can be like nothing, right? Like, let's say, for example, this person only added two lines of code, right? So it's super simple in the documentation. I mean, it can be even more simpler, right? Let's say like another person here, for example, this one made +2 -2, probably it's a typo, I would guess, right? So here, it's a typo on the documentation, right? So yeah, it is like fantastically simpler, right? In fact, I made a bunch of contributions like that one to try it out, and I became a top 100 contributor of free open source projects, which are really large, about JavaScript, and I don't know how to write JavaScript at all, right? I just like run the contribution guidelines, failed, and then fix them, right? It's super simple. So eventually you gain more and you get to there, right? But building your career, you can actually say on your resume that you are a top 100 contributors of any of the large projects without a big effort, right? So one of the, let's see how I change this. Yeah, so one of the things that I always hear people saying is that they don't have time, right? And that's true. We never have time for anything. So here's my challenge for you. Go to your calendar and block half an hour. It can be that half an hour between 2 meetings that you never use, you go for a coffee. Grab like half an hour a week and dedicate that half an hour to contribute to an open source project. I can guarantee that that half an hour is going to become the first step into a larger career, and it can change your careers or change your lives like it changed mine. I remember that every single superstar of our industry has taken that first step, right? Has taken that half an hour and made that first step. And probably the next person in this list is here in this talk now, right? Who knows? Just take a little bit of courage and just taking the leap. It's super easy. So I invite you all to become part of this whole open source universe. We all need you, right? There is plenty of room for everyone, and you can be the person building our future. Now, if you ever need help with absolutely everything, just follow me on Twitter, send me a DM. I can help you at any time. And yeah, thank you very much for being here.
Thank you very much, Andres. It was really, really nice talk. If you guys have any questions, go there and put them on the chat. While we're waiting, I'll make a similar question to what I did to Jean-Marc, which also talked about open source, because you basically talked about open source in a more, let's say, a freelancing way, right? So how to mix, or how do you think that differs from using open source at your work? Like how to motivate your company, your peers, your boss to agree that contributing to open source is something important, or how do you see that as different worlds, or
I don't.
That it just differ a little bit?
Yeah, I actually don't. So I was lucky enough that I always work at open source companies. So Red Hat was open source, Outzero was open source. Now at Hero, everything that we do is open source, like from the blockchain to the wallet, everything that we do is open source. So we just do it, right? But I'm now a manager of a team. If someone comes to me and tells me, can I get some time to work on open source, or can I get some time to fix a dependency, I would totally encourage it, right? That would be good for the person, would be good for the company, because we get more visibility. So I don't know how really to encourage my company to do so, because I've always been lucky enough to work in a place where we are using open source. But I mean, I would encourage my team to do it, right? Because it definitely has value, right, from every single point of view.
Awesome. And can you talk a little bit more about, we were talking, or at least you talked a little bit, about how to communicate, and most developers have, English as their second language and not their first language, right? So
yeah,
how, I know that we are sort of switching topics, but since you talk about advancing career, right? Yeah. Why don't you let everyone know a little bit about how important, English and IT together made a difference
Absolutely.
to your life?
Yeah, it did. It completely, I mean, as I mentioned, it did change my life, right? I mean, I'm now working at a company that pays US salaries disregarding where you live. I live in Buenos Aires. So this is like completely mind-blowing and groundbreaking for me, for my family. It changed the life of my family, changed my life, because like at the moment, money is not a problem anymore because I have the job that I have, right? In fact, the company I'm working at and my team, we have open recs for people anywhere in the world to apply, and anyone can take like a place like mine, right? You just require to have English, right? That's the only required skill at the end of the day. Even for a junior developer, right? I mean, I can talk numbers if it's not disrespectful for you. I mean, what do you think?